So, welcome to the realm of ideas is free to all. My name is Bruce Gemmel. I'm an architectural researcher, draftsman, and model maker, and watermelon ice pop eater. Anyway, welcome to episode 44, the architecturally provocative artifact, preparation and capabilities to operate within the process. Series of ruminations that I do once a week based on my kind of, my intellectual development within my particular craft as an architect. So one of the things I've started doing is rather than recap, this is episode 44. So there's been quite a few previous iterations of this particular process. But anyway, it um, goes back to December of 2024. So we've been at this for a while. It had been done on a previous platform, but I switched over to this platform when I found it to be much more kind of suitable to my needs. Anyway, so with that said, let me kind of give what I've been doing is kind of giving certain um, readings of certain pieces that had a certain pertinence to the development of ideas. This is from The Vault to the Masses, Ortega Gasset, 1930. I feel like it was probably one of the seminal kind of works in my development in terms of my perception of the way in which I saw society. And as a result, want to read from chapter 6, the dissection of the mass man begins. I have two sections that are in this kind of chapter, and I'm going to read them. They pertain to a degree to what we're talking about, but I just believe that like one of the things that kind of is better suited than kind of going through all the previous episodes that I've given, now that they're kind of numerous, is to kind of go over something that kind of could be of consequence in terms of understanding the totality. So this is the second episode on the architecturally provocative artifact, which is a kind of term that I came up with to describe things to identify within a process, what I call organic design thinking. So, what appearance did life present to the multitudinous man who, in ever increasing abundance, the 19th century kept producing? To start with, an appearance of universal material ease. Never had the average man been able to solve his economic problem with greater facility, whilst where was a proportionate decrease of great fortunes, and life became harder for the individual worker, the middle class found their economic horizon widened every day. Every day added a new luxury to their standard of life. Every day their position was more secure and more independent of another's will. What before would have been considered one of fortune's gifts, inspiring humble gratitude towards destiny, was converted into a right not to be grateful for, but to be insisted on, which was a certain mentality that Ortega saw developing in Europe in the end of the 19th century into the 20th century. And the other piece is the mass man of today, and this is he's talking about the 1930s. This leads to note down to our psychological chart of the mass man of today, two fundamental traits: the free expansion of his vital desires, and therefore of his personality, and his radical ingratitude to all these that made possible the ease of his existence. These traits together make up the well-known psychology of the spoiled child. And in fact, it would entail no error to use the psychology as a sight through which to observe the soul of the masses of today. Heir to an ample and generous past, generous both in ideas, and in activities, the new commonality has been spoiled by the world around it. To spoil means to put no limit on caprice, to give one the permission and the impression that everything is permitted to him and that he has no obligations. And as Ortega makes very clear, the thing about the mass man is he feels as if he in life has no obligations. Given his past of turmoil and instability, he has never kind of thought of the idea of obligations other than his own survival. So now that his survival has been made kind of much more simple, much more attainable, he has basically come to feel as if his life has kind of reached a level of perfection. The young child exposed to this regime has no experience of its own limits by reason of the removal of all external restraint. All clashing with other things, he comes actually to believe that he is the only one that exists and gets used to not considering others, especially not considering them to superior to himself. The feeling of another superiority could only be instilled into him by someone who, being stronger than he is, would force him to give up some desire to restrict himself, to restrain himself. He would then have learned this fundamental discipline. Here I end, and here another begins, more powerful than I am. In the world, apparently, there are two people, I myself and another superior to me. The ordinary man of past times was daily taught this elemental wisdom by the world around him, because it was a world so rudely organized that catastrophes were frequent, and there was nothing in it certain, abundant, stable. But the new masses find themselves in the presence of a prospect full of possibilities and furthermore quite secure, with everything ready at their hands, independent of the furious efforts on that part, just as we see the sun in the heavens without our hoisting it up to the shoulders. No human being thanks another for the air he breathes, for no one has produced the air for him. It belongs to the sum total of what is there, of which he says it is natural, because it never fails. And those spoiled masses are unintelligent enough to believe that the material and social, very, very important, they believe that this material and social organization placed at their disposition, like the air, is of the same origin, since apparently it never fails them and is almost as perfect as the natural scheme of things. My thesis, therefore, is this: the very perfection which, with the 19th century, gave an organization to certain orders of existence, has caused the masses, benefited therefore, to consider it not as an organized, but as a natural system. Thus, it explained and defined the absurd state of mind revealed by the masses. They are only concerned with their well-being, and at the same time, they remain alien to the cause of that well-being. They use the device completely ignorant to the capacity or the capability or the necessity of understanding the need to maintain the device that is not a given. I often use the phrase, it won't do itself. And that's the kind of thing that I think a lot of people kind of assume that it will. The system will always provide this perfection that it has provided. So these things that, like, as he said earlier, would have been meted with humble gratitude, basically are just assumed to be the case for all time. And given the fact that all people can do is kind of talk about what they deserve, even though they never understand the fact that this is a new thing that came to be as a result of great effort on many people as a constitution of their genius. Anyway, so with that said, and that's kind of like the lead into what we're going to talk about tonight, we go into our segment where we find out what's new in Julie. So, my loved one, what's new in Julie shall it be?
Well, I'm bringing it over.
Ah, good.
Yeah. Well,
Show us.
tell me when you have dry hands. Oh, I don't want you to.
I think you might want to do, because I had an ice pop. I don't want to get sticky on it. So you do the presentation, my love.
Well,
Everyone say hello, Julie.
Hello. Julie.
Hi, Julie.
Well, I completed a new science drawing at the Met yesterday, started in one today. And my completed drawing, the title and subtitle, which I will read to you, is called Stomata of a Stygian Thistle, Orthogenesis of Guard Cells. And this is my A completed drawing. We do have to figure out how to put a still image up. So for those who can hopefully see it, I'm just passing it through here. You can see close up. You can see the details. Just passing
I
it
might be
through
able to
the
hold it at the
screen.
edges.
Yeah, I think you're at a better angle.
Mhm.
You won't get the glare.
That's better. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. So explain to us what's going on here.
Well,
You had a precedent that you started from, which was a piece that you saw at the Met.
yeah, it's a really amazing Art Nouveau vase in an exhibition I'd highly recommend, which is comprised of French and Dutch and Scandinavian. And you really don't see a lot of Dutch or Scandinavian work here, but they were very active in the Scandinavian countries, particularly in Copenhagen and Denmark, and I am Danish part, and in Norway, in Finland, in Sweden. I'm Norwegian also. So, and in the Netherlands, they did a phenomenal amount of work doing very innovative things from a conceptual standpoint, a technical standpoint, with not only the forms themselves, they had pierced walls surrounding other pierced walls, things that really no one had done. They experimented with very radical and arresting and beautiful and compelling glazes. The pieces are amazing. It's at the mouth of the Lehman Wing, and it's just a phenomenal exhibition. What ties it all together, and my drawing here, is it's a celebration of the organic world. Every single vase there speaks, crawls, reproduces, jumps, leaps, buzzes, flies, and speaks. They're incredibly lively, organic. They're highly individualistic, and each one has a character, which ties right into the topic of today, the idea of expressing character in work and not falling back on preconceptions or the generic. And I think people often like to try to cast classicism as predetermined or generic, as in a mode or model. The true classics are never generic, and they're actually very unpredictable. I think what makes a true classic, whether it's classical music, opera, drawing, sculpture, architecture, is the fact that it has an immense amount of individual imperative character, voice, and substance. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
So, all right. Do you want to talk about how you actually went about making the piece?
Oh,
I mean,
sure.
not just like in
What
terms of like,
specifically?
well, I mean, uh, we see the image.
Yeah.
We understand the piece, the ceramic piece that's basically
Mhm.
a substrate
Right.
of invention, but we don't know anything about the way in which you constructed the actual piece.
Oh,
Like
sure.
why these are the colors, why these are the shapes, why these
Oh,
are the
sure.
things, what this is, what that is.
Okay, thanks. I'd be happy to discuss.
Mm-hmm.
The very challenging thing was the piece itself uses a series of overlaying prongs and that create a huge depth of field. It has a seam, a central seam, and quadrants. And the seam almost looks like a series of partially healed scars that are still pooling pus or plasma. And that's in the areas here, here, and here up along the spine. Now, when I saw these, they instantly evoked stomata in plants.
And the
And
stomata is
oh, yes, it is an aperture that allows plants to breathe. It's what allows plants to exchange the gases that keep them alive. So it is basically a gas exchange aperture. And the opening and closing of that aperture is by the parenchyma known as guard cells. And you can see a whole bunch of guard cells. There are stomata in various stages of development, which is the key thing that I drew here. Is this piece that I drew as an entire piece and invented a way to use colored pencils, both the Prismacolor, which are fairly standard, and the Derwent metallics, to evoke a very radical glaze that I hadn't seen on any other piece. It looks like amber. I mean, it's a glaze that's kind of impersonating a semi-precious, and it's not a stone because amber is resin. It's tree sap, for those of you who don't know. A lot of people think amber's stone. Amber's not stone. It's dried resin or tree sap that has captured insects, pieces of plants from an incredibly long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
What else can I tell you? And then you want me to tell you how I progressed to this
Mm-hmm.
side?
Wow.
So what's going on this side is the deconstruction in my mind's eye, in my imagination, of the whole piece, as if this piece was being pulled apart by generative forces and remade, being transformed, self-transcription, I would say. This is a kinetic portrait of evolution. And the whole theme is, and this was inspired by a science article in the journal Science, how plants respond to extreme heat. Not a hot day here or there, but extreme heat over months, years, centuries, thousands of years. Plants sprout and grow rapidly extra stomata, extra aperture.
So
yeah.
unlike whereas we may
Yeah.
breathe more rapidly if exhausted,
Yeah.
what happens is in order to cool the body,
Mhm.
in order to cool the plant, they actually grow more stomata. So basically there's an increase in the number of stomata in terms of being able to kind of like have greater
To breathe.
exhalation of the gases
And inhalation.
Right. So the inhalation and exhalation is regulated by increasing the number of stomata when necessary.
But here's what's key that I've depicted in my drawing: the asymmetry in this rush to evolve. And the whole point of this is that the rapidly materializing versions of the stomata, which would normally be very symmetrical, are asymmetrical.
Mm-hmm.
And they're quickly formed. So they aren't going to function like symmetrical, planned stomata
Mm-hmm.
in regular, predictable patterns. Sorry,
Mm-hmm.
would you like to say something?
No, just so basically what happens is a kind of there's a very quick adaptation to a circumstance based on the fact that this is something that occurs. Now, I'm assuming that the more severe the circumstance, the more haphazard it appears as the time to kind of develop.
Oh, yes. And the
less.
addition of increased lipid layer, meaning plants self-insulate with lipids. For those of you who don't know, lipids are fats, and they accrue fat molecules in their endoplasmic reticulum, meaning they actually have walls that basically fatten up to insulate and protect them and keep the moisture in too.
Interesting. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's certainly an interesting thing, and I think you kind of illustrated that quite succinctly. I kind of feel as if like you can kind of see the sense of a kind of a urgency.
It's very tumultuous.
Kind of like, there's definitely there's a sense of urgency in order to kind of like get these things into condition that could allow for the persistence and the kind of survival of the organism. Thank you, Pavel.
You're welcome.
Okay. So I think that brings us to today's topic, which is last week we talked about the architecturally provocative artifact, which is basically the key component in organic design thinking. And what I think happens is this comes about as a result of a certain circumstance, just like the fact that certain conditions are put on plants, animals, etc., and they adapt. Uh,
Very extreme conditions.
yes,
Yeah.
I think conditions are such
Hmm.
in society where the evolution or the kind of like destiny, as Ortega would say, comes about upon a group, and
Hmm.
they basically kind of either fall, they accept it and appreciate and
Hmm.
advance, or they fall below, and society basically kind of starts to crumble. Culturally, right now, I would say that we're in a bit of a backwater. I think that there's been a kind of a lack of novelty, lack of provocation within the arts and within culture. And I don't know, it's a long, drawn out thing to go into why, but I just kind of get a sense that clearly is. So as a result, I think what happens is when circumstances like this happen, there's always kind of like some opportunity for genius to kind of compel itself to create a kind of a correction in order to kind of right the ship.
It's a great word for what you're describing.
Say,
It's in the subtitle of my drawing,
oh,
orthogenesis.
oh, explain.
Okay, this is a Lamarckian idea that supposedly runs against the Darwinian idea, but I don't think it does. I'll explain, of natural selection. It does not. As I understand it, orthogenesis in its true sense, what
Nothing.
is the rapid progress with goals in mind that an animal or human would undergo. And they didn't include plants because people didn't understand the intelligence of plants actually
Mm,
then.
mm,
They still don't now, but there have been
mm,
certain specials
mm,
on that.
mm,
It is a rapid gallop of progressive evolution in response to immediate and extreme circumstances to evolve along certain lines. It is a
mm.
directed, precise, rapid evolution, but that does not run counter
No,
to
it doesn't.
natural. So, okay, so I think that's exactly
Yeah,
is the right
I
word.
think so.
Or yeah.
And I think
Right.
also in terms of like symbiogenesis, in
Mm-hmm.
terms of the work of Lynn Margulis,
Mm-hmm.
a similar kind of idea. But I think what happens is, science and certain people can obviously
Mm-hmm.
be incredibly stupid in the fact that, like, I remember when I was little, those big bumblebees, were
I
kind of
love those.
were really beautiful flyers.
Yeah, they
But
are.
scientists and science teachers would always say like, well, we rather than saying we don't know how they fly,
Yeah.
they said they can't fly,
Well, they obviously could
because we
fly.
hadn't understood, which was
Yeah.
obviously they were
Yeah.
flying, but they couldn't. We had not at that point figured it out.
Mm-hmm.
Now again, it's like I remember like this funny science joke. It's like this guy was kind of saying like that he had a frog with two legs, and he kind of like stimulated the frog's legs and it jumped,
Mm-hmm.
and then he kind of like cut off one, and he wrote down in his book, frog with two legs can jump, and then he kind of cut off one leg and it kind of like stimulated again, and it's like kind of like the frog jumped awkwardly but jumped. He wrote his book, Frog with One Leg Can Jump, and then he kind of cut off the other leg and he kind of prodded it, but it couldn't jump. And he goes like, "Frog with no legs is deaf."
Great. I
So,
think I remember that.
I want to think,
Kind of
yeah, exactly. But I love these kind of things where you'll hear these people
this is a
who will
case of
say,
that.
"Well, evolution couldn't possibly explain how life has adapted so quickly, and with only 3.7 billion years on Earth, we couldn't have possibly done this in this way."
Well, we did.
And the answer is, of course we
Of course
fucking
we
did.
did.
The answer, it certainly is. We just haven't figured out all the kind of like
Mhm.
complexities and intricacies yet. But it's kind of like if I see a road and I see a car on it and it kind of says Michigan,
Yeah.
and I kind of said like, well, okay, this car like, has a Michigan license plate. I don't know if it could have possibly come here from Michigan because I can't see Michigan if I look up the road. I mean, but this is the kind of stupidity that a lot of people engage in.
No, I use it as a guide on how to cut a watermelon. But I mean,
Yeah,
that's
right.
as
So
absurd,
it's kind of
you
like, so
know?
the idea is, yes, of course it happened, right? We may not understand all the intricacies, but
Mhm.
we realize that if we assume that the time frame is based on the idea of kind of like gradual mutation, which is how larger organisms seem to change over time, that may not kind of fall in line. But then again, when you think about orthogenesis, symbiogenesis, and this idea of network composing, it makes a lot more sense. And it's kind of like saying like, oh yeah, that kind of like would give us certain, intricacies and certain kind of abilities to kind of adapt time wise. And again, given the fact that nature has kind of like, peaks and valleys in terms of like stress, right? The
Yeah.
idea of symbio or orthogenesis, where kind of like radical shifts take place as a
Very
result of
directed,
high
very
stress,
quickly. Yeah.
things can kind of
In
have
response.
incredibly dramatic responses.
Yes, they
I
can.
mean, what is it? What is it? The one that like that actually the photosynthesizing.
Oh, yes, it's a subject of my new drawing I started today.
Mhm.
It's the lettuce sea slug, and it's the only animal that photosynthesizes and acts like a plant.
Right,
It
because
steals it takes what are called kleptoplasts,
right.
and these are chloroplasts from algae,
Mhm.
and it's called kleptoplasty. And there's actually a name for it, and the only animal that engages in kleptoplasty, or the theft, and it isn't one species and another, it's a completely different kind of organism.
Right, exactly. And it wouldn't have been a kind of like gradual adaptation to kind of like photosynthesize. Basically, as Lynn Margulis, explained, and I saw, it's that in times of extreme stress, you take into the fact that you eat what's available, you consume what's available, and as a result, sometimes these things become absorbed and become part of they adapt to your organism rather than simply being consumed into a series of nutrients.
Well, yes,
So,
yeah.
the chloroplasts basically kind of like sustained themselves within the tissues of the sea slug. And it's like,
Even
okay,
better,
okay, yeah, same.
they have developed a way to store them.
Right.
And without the DNA structural changes that humans had predicted that they'd need.
Mhm.
So this happened very, very quickly. And if they get really hungry, they can just absorb the actual kleptoplasts
From the
and
algae
eat them
itself.
and live on them. No, from their own bodies.
Oh, from their own.
From
Oh,
their
okay.
own
Okay, so they
bodies.
actually can become their own host.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, go ahead. So I mean,
Yeah.
there's a
They are
situation
their
where.
own supermarket, their
Okay.
own refrigerator.
So there's a
It's
perfect
pretty great.
example of the fact that they've come to
Yeah.
kind of see themselves in that same kind of adaptive
They
role.
developed an organ to store them
There you go.
that
So
has no precedent.
yeah, makes sense.
Yay.
Okay, so
Okay.
in that kind of sense of
Yeah.
capability, we kind of like we were going to do near the end of last week's discussion where we're talking about the architecturally provocative artifact, and we were talking more in terms of like how to identify it and understand and appreciate it.
Mhm.
We came across the fact that why is this process pertinent now, and what would make it such that one would be prepared to be able to activate and engage in that process now. And we kind of thought about precedents in history and circumstances that kind of seem to be kind of analogies, as well as kind of like the idea of what were the circumstances that allow it to be the case today. And one of the things I remember was the fact that like near the end of the 19th century in the art world, it seemed as if there was an incapability, given the standard operations of painting in the classical sense, to be able to kind of appreciate the added potential of consequence of expression that had been brought up by kind of things like psychoanalysis and other things that existed in the kind of in the 19th century. So as a result, people with certain capabilities were able to forge new processes of kind of greater and more complex abstractions than the ones that previously existed, in terms of being more kind of like representationally based, as opposed to kind of things that were kind of like more non-figural and kind of like psychologically based. So there still was a necessity to kind of understand character, but at the same time, the way in which character could be kind of much more complex had to be able to be expressed through this kind of advanced abstract kind of like psychological kind of like reality. So we saw that people abandoned a lot of those standard kind of occupations, but they did so because they had the technical capabilities. So the ability to draw, the ability to paint, the ability to understand composition, and most importantly, the ability to understand abstraction in a much more complex way,
Mhm.
a much more intricate way, gave rise to the birth of people who were capable of kind of taking us into the 20th century and doing these things that had a much more kind of like deep resonance in terms of emotional kind of like expression.
Mhm.
And I think that, for me, the greatest unique, most kind of like novel and provocative expression was that of the surrealists. I mean, the surrealists were really capable of kind of like demonstrating an understanding of the unconscious in a way that they were capable of seeing things not in a simply in a figural way, but in a kind of psychological way.
Mhm.
Now, where I think it all falls apart is those people who came after them did not have the same technical capabilities, so they weren't as able to make as compelling abstractions, and as a result, the whole thing started to fall apart. But out of the ruins rises the phoenix. I believe that in a certain way, these things happen and they collapse, and as a result, other opportunities are presented. As a result of the kind of inertia of the business model of the art world, there certainly was enough inertia to kind of at least continue to believe that there was a kind of like a consequence to painting, but it certainly didn't demonstrate itself. And eventually, what happened was it just became a kind of like, kind of it just became something where people could fabricate whatever myth
Mhm.
they wanted based on the fact that the complexity of the work had always been beyond that of the buyer. And as a result, that was the case. Unfortunately, one of the things that's made things more complicated now is that artists went from being the genius who would profess an understanding and explain a certain complexity. We've now have artists kind of being just pandering to whatever is the novelty or the fad or the fashion of the time. So going from people who were larger than life figures to people who were basically unknown.
They're the toadies of the gallery owners. They do what they're told,
Yeah, yeah,
and they don't create anything novel, anything
no,
original, anything
no,
compelling,
no. But anyway,
anything
what happened
interesting.
was, I
Yeah.
think, as a result, there was a good example of a success of there was an opportunity afforded by the greater depth of understanding of the nature of the individual through an understanding of the brain and the psychology of the unconscious, which basically gave rise to a certain circumstance that allowed people to progress in terms of their ability to take up that challenge. And given their capabilities, they were able to be successful for a
Mhm.
reasonable amount of time. And then they got bogged down. Now, in my case, as an architect, I saw, and I didn't really think about this until last week when it came up, the opportunity within the architectural circumstance because of the fact that there was a kind of like inertial uh, nature to formality and organization, and novelty had basically been kind of like abandoned or forgotten as even something that one should kind of think about. So, um, when I started to look at certain places and certain things, I started to think about this kind of like provocation, what I would call the provocation of novel utility. And by utility, I mean activities. And, the sense of the fact that we have these formalities that we kind of have in terms of like sitting and lying and walking and things like that. And we never really have questioned these things deeply. We simply have a laundry list that's given to us by a client, and then we basically kind of like put them in some sense of organization. But because we don't have the capability to understand that deeply enough, we have fixated in a kind of fetishistic way on appearance. So since the consequence of the since the internal understanding has become superficial, it has become kind of like a narcissus in the fact that we kind of like have tried to create an idea of kind of falling in love with our appearance. So as a result, I think to myself, this idea of trying to provoke that novel utility, to start to kind of think of other things that could kind of lead to more kind of like better understanding of a kind of like organic reality. How do we go about doing that? And I think the idea was the organic design thinking provokes the idea that there are ways to kind of like look past again this this kind of kind of inertial process that is basically not addressing the opportunities of our particular circumstance. But then you think, just the same way that the people in the early 20th century, late 19th century were prepared for it, what was that circumstance in terms of like the preparations that was necessary for this? And I also have a parallel in a kind of like in a related field that seems to kind of be going on at the same time, and that would be performance and symphonic and classical music. And I think one of the things that happened was one of the great benefits of being a draftsman is understanding the importance of character, not of character of yourself, but an honesty of yourself in order to identify character within the objects that have been expressed, so that the expression of yours can basically understand the depth of the character that basically exists. So in drawing, one expresses the character of that which is the subject. Now, in the case of architects never were kind of given any inkling that the character of the objects that they created were able to kind of provoke any of this novel utility because they were never aware of the character. And as a result, nothing happened. It simply was the same stale, inconsequential circumstance.
Would you say uninspired?
I would say, yeah, I'd say completely uninspired. So, the idea is how do we open up and develop this kind of novelty? How do we kind of get at that kind of provocative kind of sense where we can kind of see those things that can kind of give us a new consequence? So that was the idea. And if necessary to do this is a need to bring certain capabilities and abilities. Modern artists were ready to make the destiny, but the destiny of the artist of the time in the late century were unable to engage that destiny because they lacked the capabilities. So what are the capabilities that one needs, and what are the things that are kind of possible to engage in an architecturally, in kind of organic design thinking in order to kind of provoke and appreciate the architecturally provocative artifact. Now, the architecturally provocative artifact is that thing that has the potential to provoke novel utility. In order to do that, one has to be able to identify it, and then one needs to be able to kind of like develop it. I'd never even thought about the fact that there had to be the ability to do that. It's kind of like, well, in order to kind of climb to the top of a mountain, one has to understand what being a mountain climber is. Now, to the artists of the late 19th and early 20th century, they didn't really think about these things in terms of not being prepared. They just set about to do the work. Some of them might have thought about it, but the idea was, in order to kind of create these things, we need to kind of look at certain things and see how we can figure them out. And they set about doing that. But it was not the way in which people had been made to paint. And in fact, a lot of the great painters of the early 20th century, mid 20th century, were dropouts from art school because they found that the art school was basically leading them in the wrong direction. I feel right now that for the most part, architectural school is leading people in the wrong direction. There are a few people that I know of who I could say kind of work against the tide. But I remember kind of like when I was kind of coming across some of these ideas in the 80s and 90s, I just felt as if, there was no benefit to kind of staying in the university because there was no one there who really understood what it was that I was saying. Mm-hmm. So I thought to myself, this is not going to get me anywhere. I might as well go out there and kind of do this on my own. Now I kind of see as if there are some people who are swimming against the tide, but again, they're few and far between. And I don't know, some of them have kind of like, at least the ones that I know of, have had a certain amount of a modicum of success, but nothing of great, kind of effectiveness. Anyway, so that brings me to the understanding of like, what are those things that the architect has at his disposal to be able to kind of create these things and kind of benefit from this process in order to kind of be able to kind of get to the point where they can find these things and understand what these things are. And I believe those two things are one, drawing, and two, and two, model building. And by model building, I basically just mean three-dimensional drawing. I mean, believe that like two-dimensional drawing and three-dimensional drawing, model building is basically the same thing. So kind of going from each point of view, it's still a basic nature of perspective. It's simply kind of moving around the object, getting inside the object, and kind of finding ways in which you can kind of nurture that thing that you see. So as we said before, like, form and function, rather than form follows one or one follows the other, is the fact that they neither follows each other. They basically symbiotically exist as a process. So form and function are a process by which they explore, identify, and reveal themselves. So, one of the things I was saying to somebody today is that the greatest thing about my curiosity was that it found a great partner in my imagination, and that my imagination basically kind of fell in love with my curiosity because they always supplied each other with something to do. But the thing about the drawing is, we'll talk about this in a couple of weeks, drawing basically is again struggling because I think a lot of people, like in music, have been told that one's job is pretty much just translation, not transcription or interpretation. And as a result, I think what's happening is people have gotten kind of fed up and frustrated with the fact that we're not advancing. So not only do I feel that a truly organic architecture has to be done unconsciously, it kind of basically, the only way I see it being done is basically unconsciously through a situation where you study the project from the process itself. Now, what I mean by that is that, the way in which the way in which a process produces objects will be novel in the fact that the things that will produce will have a novel relation to each other as well as to the things themselves. So, drawing has an immediate expressive character. It has the ability to immediately express the character of a circumstance. And that immediacy is what basically allows that simultaneous curiosity and imagination to kind of find ways to kind of interpret that things that it sees in itself. So rather than simply a prescription for an organization that is completely artificial, one basically finds the natural circumstance in the thing itself, whatever that artifact becomes. The artifact basically becomes something that's precedent, that allows you to kind of have that sense of affection, that allows you to kind of interpret it into something and then make iterations. Mm-hmm. So basically, in terms of music, what's interesting now is that a lot of musicians who are incredibly frustrated with the overproduction of incredibly proficient, brilliant musicians who spend all their time going to competitions, working really hard, and then spending the next week or two or months crying and lamenting, why did I spend all this time becoming a musician, because I'll never make a living, and it's horrible that that the competition is so stiff and so fierce. And none of this is kind of really kind of like I hear this from musicians all the time. None of this is kind of fulfilling in any way. It's not meaningful. I don't feel anything more that I kind of like shame, I kind of like have to like just practice and practice and practice based on someone else's idea of what the interpretation of someone else's music is. And as we read last week in, Self-Sufficiency, in Self-Reliance by Emerson, the idea is that which comes from the individual is that which is what should basically be pursued. And that's not the case. So what I'm finding and I'm enjoying, and I kind of was fortunate enough, and Julie and I got a chance to see a concert by a friend of ours who is a brilliant cellist, Tamar Sagiv, and she has come to that realization that she feels that as a musician, she is best suited to understand the music. And as a result, feels perfectly reasonable that composition and improvisation are those tools by which she can create music. Now, this to me makes perfect sense, but she said this is something that, for the most part, people are coming to this understanding, but begrudgingly against the nature of the profession. I find the similar thing will be the case, in architecture in terms of like organic design thinking, because I think what happens is, there's a tremendous amount of invested in something that is basically still somewhat productive in a way, but at the same time, not compelling. I think that, aside from like, very fetishy, fatty looking things, there's really been no real significant discoveries in, I don't know, you could say anywhere from like 50 to 100 to 250 years, maybe longer. But the formalities with which we progress have really become incredibly stale. So that sense where we're starting to see, just like we saw at the end of the 1970s, when the music industry had stifled creativity to the point where there was like five, bands, and they all played the same 12 songs, and it just became insufferably boring and tedious. And I can't remember, like, was it Journey was one of the bands, and like was like Pink Floyd and stuff like that. Where that kind of like, was that who they were?
No, it was
But who were
more
the
like the cover bands.
No, I'm saying who were the bands that were the only bands that existed in the late 70s?
Yes,
The,
and the
the
Who.
Who, right? And
Um,
was Pink Floyd one of
yeah,
them?
yeah, they
And
were around.
Journey.
Yeah, they were
Okay,
around.
so like this was it.
Journey
There was
came
like,
more in the
okay, and like
80s.
Genesis. No.
Led
Led Zeppelin.
Zeppelin,
Okay. Led Zeppelin's
Genesis.
okay. Again, not
Yeah,
but again, it was like, it was
yeah,
just so
like the same
so
bunch.
narrow and just so
Yeah, it
limited.
wasn't really
And then
very exciting.
all of a sudden, out of nowhere came this ability where people realized we could make our own music and we could just pass it amongst ourselves.
Mm,
And I remember in the late 70s, what was it called? New Age?
New
New
wave,
Wave, with New Wave. And
like
then
the
yeah,
Cars and
exactly. But came from there were like these my particular, you know, uh,
mhm,
fascination was the hardcore scene, and the hardcore
mhm,
scene in kind of like, the UK, and especially in America, in New York City, was, the situation where people were making their own, somebody knew somebody who worked in a place and they had a record machine and they kind of were producing their own tapes and their own records, and we
mhm,
would be like, they'd be pressing them and then kind of like selling them at
mhm,
the shows. So out of nowhere, suddenly there was like 3,000 bands all over the place, and like,
mhm,
the record companies and the radio stations couldn't control it. It kind of developed its life of its own. My feeling is there will be a similar revolution in classical music, in the fact that, following in the kind of footsteps of people like Anna Klein and some of these other people who basically kind of compose and play, that we'll see more people like Tamar, I mean, who is brilliant, and see the fact that this idea that, instead of having like, that any musician, rather than just simply saying I can only be a musician, will basically assume that yes, I can be a composer.
mhm.
And basically, I think as a result, there'll be a tremendous opportunity for a great diversity of types of music that will, um, evolve. Because I mean, these people have been repressed for so long. I think the same desire exists in architecture. I think that for the most part, I mean, first of all, architecture is not a compelling thing within the public realm. And I think that people see architects the same way they see dentists or accountants. They're like minor, insignificant people who make nothing of consequence. Whereas when you look back to people like Buckminster Fuller and Frank Lloyd Wright and Bruce Goff, these were larger than life figures who kind of like gave gave light to visions of things that seem to be beyond our comprehension. Certainly isn't
And
the
they
case anymore.
still are for most people.
Those people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, like I said, and we covered this in earlier episodes, I think there was a kind of a there was an there was an attempt to kind of attack the envy, and mediocrity mediocrity's envy will always want to attack
Hmm.
genius. And in the case of, I'd say the generation of the 1960s in architecture in the United States, which also had a big influence on the European continent, there was a kind of like, there was an envy of genius that basically kind of like tried to suppress a reality and then basically kind of substituted something of inconsequence, which has, for the most part, produced nothing of consequence and now is dying out, fortunately. And as a result, some of these things are kind of now being able to be re-examined and
Can I
yeah.
interject
No.
one thing? I
Nope.
want to stop you there.
No.
If I
You're
may.
interjecting.
What?
Look at you interjecting like that.
Well,
Yeah.
you're on the Brucey log.
I
so-
love. Well, that's the thing. It's like a little
Yeah, I
Brucey.
know.
Go.
It's
Interject.
It's the
Interject.
Brucia.
Interject.
Yeah. So what I wanted to mention as regarding Buckminster Fuller, very few architects, and I spend a lot of time with architects, and
That's your choice, though. I can't. You can't. You have nobody.
yeah, okay.
You have nobody to blame but yourself.
Out. Do
You
not.
spend more time with architects than I do.
I probably do.
I know.
Anyway, I'd like to do a shout out to the really great folks at the AIA-NY, the Center for Architecture, because they actually are much more open-minded than a lot of other architects that I've met. They actually have a whole series of programs where you can speak out in a roundtable type of fashion and exchange ideas. And what I wanted to segue to is most of the people I've met there are very unfamiliar with Buckminster Fuller's work. And now,
Really?
What?
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Let me just say,
Mhm.
after decades, you would think that people would be, I'm more familiar with it, and I'm not an architect, but as an example of precisely what I'm saying, the suppression of character across multiple disciplines and multiple fields is during the design week here in New York City. There was exactly one exhibition, I'm not even sure I can hold that, of Buckminster Fuller's models, and it was in a storefront
Oh, I remember
in
that.
Soho, like
Yeah, I
on
remember that.
Grand Street. And that's where the foundation is an offshoot. And it's basically run by one guy who's the son of Buckminster Fuller's former partner. It's like the joke in Spaceballs, which is, I think, still quite a funny film, is I am the brother of your sister's second roommate. And he said, and he said, what does that make us? He said, absolutely nothing. And like the point is, this guy was very nice, runs an interiors firm. They seem to do very respectable, work, nothing like Fuller's work. I mean, they aren't trying to be on the cutting edge. They were very nice people, very professional, very, very competent, nice, clean aesthetic, not inventive in any way. And they had the original Dymaxion car, the Dymaxion house, a lot of his models, the Fullerene, the Bucky Dome, and it was literally 15 or 20 models in a storefront that was maybe 10 by 15 feet in one room. And I was the only one in that room with the guy. It wasn't like it was crowded. And then two other women walked in looking for a cappuccino cafe and then walked out. So this is how people know, and this is in Soho, during design week. This was a listed event. And I found that very disturbing.
It is disturbing.
I think wanted to add that.
No, I think that is disturbing because I think what happens is
it not?
Yes, it is. Yeah. It's very much about what I was saying is that when people get to the certain point where, one has lost the essence of what makes something, and they're just basically kind of like making facsimiles. So the idea is kind of like, in fact, after next week, because 2 weeks from now we'll kind of pick this up again. But next week we're doing the final on your birthday. Happy birthday, Puddle. Thanks. Of the end of 2D design.
I'll be 35.
Yes, again.
Yes.
And after that we're going to go into drawing and copying, and I'm basically going to start with a quote from Whitehead in terms of the idea of novelty and the fact that in Adventures of Ideas, he talks about the fact that one can chart how someone else has accomplished something of consequence, but it doesn't mean that one can do it exactly the same way, because not only is that certain that approach is basically a process of context, it basically is a process of novelty, and therefore can't be duplicated in order to basically make that novelty again. So the idea is the people who made, yes, the people who made the things did not make them in the sense that they were trying to copy anyone else. So the sense of kind of copying and drawing, I think, is a pertinent analogy to kind of get back to when we kind of get back to that from what we're going to talk about next week, which is really special because Julie will basically kind of conclude all the things that we did. And that became a 3-part series. That was supposed to just be a single one.
You couldn't
but I think
possibly cover what's
we could probably go on for other things too. So any last thoughts, my little one?
Oh, lots, but I don't have time.
Okay. And the same with me. So I think what happens is, we're kind of getting these situations where, I also want to thank the fact that we've started to get some likes and some follows and some participation, thanks to our friends at the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
Yes,
thank you to our
a lot of the gallery guards have really supported us.
Yep. And we appreciate that.
We appreciate that, and we love our friends at the Met, and they, like we, see art as the panacea, which it is.
That's the guy with the nose, right?
What?
The guy with the nose, panacea.
Yeah,
kind of like, I like him. I like the.
He wants to be a real art.
Oh, I like that. Okay, so all right. So next week it is episode 45, which is the conclusion of the loss of 2D design, followed the next week by drawing and copying, and basically the idea of kind of provocation of novelty.
And I do have a final thought.
Say.
We need to ascribe the same ascension of character, this same narrative of purpose to animals, and especially plants that are much forgotten and dismissed and maligned as lesser, less intelligent, and they're not given the rights of an individual. I think very few people outside of us, and maybe a few very forward-thinking plant scientists, see plants as acting individually. They are seen as a hive mind, just the way, a hymenopterist used to see the bees in a beehive. Turns out they're all highly individualistic. They have friends, they have likes, they have hatreds, they have jealousies, they have preferences in food, and so do plants. And being able to be recognized as an individual is paramount for progress and acceptance by other species.
Yep. And we'll talk about that guy Panacea with the nose.
Yeah, that is funny.
All right. So the realm of ideas is free to all, and it's to the benefit of all for us to maintain it just that way. Thank you.
Amen to that.